Hello and welcome. I'm Stuart Crane, a co-founder of Thinkers50. Every year, Thinkers50 inducts new management thinkers into its Hall of Fame, which is supported by our partners at the Hire Group. The Hall of Fame recognizes and celebrates thinkers who have made a significant long-term contribution to management thinking and practice. This year's inductees into the Hall of Fame are a stellar group, and it is a pleasure to recognize their contribution. My guest today is one of those inductees, Stella Nkomo. Stella, welcome and congratulations on being inducted into the Hall of Fame. Stella is a professor in the Department of Human Resource Management in the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. She's a former scholar in residence at the Bunting Institute of Harvard University and a visiting scholar at the Tuck Business School of Dartmouth College. Her internationally recognized research on diversity, human resource management, and leadership in organizations has been published in numerous journals and edited volumes. Stella is also co-author with Ella Bell Smith of the critically acclaimed Harvard Business School Press book, Our Separate Ways, Black and White Women in the Struggle for Professional Identity. Her most recent research focuses on diversity practices in Africa and the relationship between diversity ideologies and practices. Stella, welcome. How do you did I miss anything out from that resume?
No, thank you, Stuart, and thanks to Thinkers50. No, you didn't. I think that was a great summary.
So how do you make sense of your career? If you look back, what's the kind of golden, how do you make logic from it in your own mind? What did it start with, a passion that carried on, or what's the golden thread?
Oh, thank you so much. Oh, well, let me just put it in context to get to that golden thread. I grew up in a large family in New York City. We were quite poor, and so it was a struggle as a young African American girl to get an education. But over time, I began to realize that, being different meant that you did not have opportunities for many things. And so I think by the time I got to university, which was a struggle, I became very curious about how do people who are different, who don't fit, quote unquote, the dominant pattern. I was thinking about my own experiences, but I did begin to think about what is that like? Has anybody looked at that? And so when I started my doctoral studies at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, Stuart, I wanted to study that. But at that time, 1978, management and organization studies had no interest in the question of race and difference or diversity. Diversity didn't even exist, but I always had this interest in what is it like to be different. And I had gotten an MBA, so I worked in corporate America. And again, it was the same experience. Very few women, very few people of color. So when I got to my doctoral studies, I vowed that I would study this topic. Unfortunately, my supervisors at UMass told me it was not an important topic. So I couldn't study it for my PhD. But as soon as I got my PhD and my first full-time academic appointment, I decided I was going to study it no matter what anyone told me. So the golden thread is I've always been interested in this issue of social difference and what it's like to be different from whatever a dominant group might be, whether it was gender, race, and over time, even recognizing the issue of social identity and class. Because the world is patterned for certain people and not for others.
And it's amazing talking to you that and obviously I was alive at that time as well, but the 1970s and 80s, I mean, in the broad sweep of history is a nanosecond ago, is not very long ago at all. But it's difficult to conceive for younger people listening to us and watching how different the world was and how people were, or not indifferent to what you wanted to look at, but it wasn't really understood as a concept or worthy of study in any way.
No, it wasn't. And I was told that if I studied it, I probably would not do well in my academic career. So I do get satisfaction that what I was asking about was indeed important. And over time, you can see now that there are many more scholars who are looking at the question of social difference and diversity in organizations. So that I find very uplifting, Stuart, that eventually the light bulb went off and it got onto the radar screen of a lot of people. I think the sad thing is, though, as I look at some of the research and some of the issues, some of the things that I raised and thought about are still not resolved. Not that we're looking for a recipe answer, but it does dishearten me that a lot of the experiences that people talk about, while there was some progress, we haven't gone as far as we should go.
Yeah, I was talking to Sally Hagelson the other day, who's researched women's leadership, yeah. and she was reminding me that being researching into women's leadership in the 1980s was a career dead end for many academics. And so why did you want to be an academic? What drove you down that particular route?
Oh, okay, that's a simple answer. As I told you, I grew up as one of 10 children in a very poor family. My mother and father only had elementary school education, and education allowed me to have a different life and a different opportunity. So I decided that I wanted to be an educator and to help other young people get educated, because education was an opportunity to change your life. And so I became very passionate about teaching. I still love teaching. I still, particularly now, even though I'm semi-retired, I am right now in South Africa, spending a lot of time mentoring early career academics and supporting them to do well in their own education. But education is a route to making a difference on an individual level and a broader societal level. Yeah, so yeah, I'm a firm believer. I tell young people, education, what you know and what you understand, can never be taken away from you. It can be a platform for your own individual investment, but also improving society.
And I think what's changed over the recent decades in particular is the appreciation that the issues you have raised are global.
Yes.
And I think that's progress. And you're a professor at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. So when did you first go to South Africa? When was your first experience there?
My first experience in South Africa, I married a South African, and that's how I ended up going to South Africa. I went to South Africa, interestingly, with my colleague Ella Bell after we published the first issue of Our Separate Ways, which would have been 2001. We published the book. So the first time I went to South Africa was 1999. And it was just after the elections. And I can tell you, things were quite raw. In fact, the University of Pretoria, where I am now, they had actually, the students there had actually chased Nelson Mandela away from the campus when he came to give a guest lecture as president. So when I got to South Africa permanently in 2001, I found a country trying to figure out what does it mean? What should we be doing to transform our country to deal with the social injustice that had happened with apartheid? So that came right at a moment where I had to do a lot of education about what are the transformation issues. In fact, we don't often use the word diversity, we say the challenge is, how do we transform this society? So that's when I got to South Africa and began looking at quote unquote social difference in the South African context, given the history of apartheid.
And what surprised you about that experience?
Well, this is what's interesting, Stuart. I tell people, and I think some people, unless you knew the history of the US and South Africa, maybe it's a subtle point. But I said, okay, I came from a context where the civil rights movement in the United States also had to fight against the government. The government was not always in support of African Americans getting their rights. So, and the issues of discrimination and diversity were very difficult in that context. So when I got to South Africa, I thought, okay, there's a new democratic government, there's a new constitution. The government is leading the charge for transformation and social justice. But I can tell you this, the work was just as difficult, even in a society where the government was not the problem. Because in the end, the fact is, for change in terms of accepting social difference, it's structural, but it's also getting every single individual to understand, what does that mean? What is the work that I should be doing? So even though I thought it might be easier because of the government being for social justice, and the Constitution already had in there, everyone is equal, we want to build a non-racial, a non-sexist society. It was very explicit. Where in the US, we don't see that kind of language in the Constitution. And so, but this is when you said it was global. We have a problem in the world, and understanding equality. We have a problem of discrimination. Some group is always excluded, or some group is always marginalized, even in societies that you think are advanced. And it is a global problem, it is a human problem that we have not figured out how to accept each other as humans. We're all together on this planet. And what are we going to do to recognize our common humanity and to accept people on the level of who they are and affirm them versus exclusion, microaggressions, marginalization, domination?
Yeah, the difference is universal and always, it seems, a source of difficulty and division.
Yes, it is, and in organizations, you look at the numbers. Like, I'm in the U.S. now, and articles are just coming out where you see that many of the issues that I wrote about early in my career are still there. And you look at the Fortune 500 list. And we know that women and people of color often have the same credentials, even sometimes the same number of years of experience. And there's still barriers, there's still exclusion, there's still structural barriers. There's still the idea that certain groups can perform better. You think CEO, you think of a man. So yeah, I mean, that is kind of bittersweet for me. In fact, the book that Bell and I published in 2001, which is 21 years ago, Harvard Business School Press just reissued it because they said the issues that you raised in that book and that you learned about are the same issues that women talk about today. So we didn't even have to change much of the book. And that, I think, is sad commentary on corporations and organizations.
Let's talk about the book. Our Separate Ways is the
Yes.
title of the book. And it was an 8-year research project,
Yes.
120 interviews and surveys. 825 black and white managers you looked at. So it was a colossal piece of work, and shed light on the different career trajectories of black and white managers. Did you come out of it feeling, well, I don't know, how did you emerge from the process? I mean, it's a big, deep process with lots of dispiriting conclusions and findings.
Yeah, okay, yeah. We let me say why we did the book the way we did. I think this is important. As I said, you know, the 80s, women were finally breaking through into corporate America. You know, everybody's talking about the glass ceiling, but women began to get into the corporate setting. And what we noticed is nobody talked about, well, what about Black women? What about women of color? So we wanted to really people to understand something very important: the intersection of race and gender. Not all women are the same. And that's why we did the study. So by doing that study, Stuart, we were able to really get a deep insight into what were the differences in these women's paths to getting into corporate America. They were all senior women. And so we made it clear. I think what we found is race and gender makes a difference. When you do the intersection, that Black women were lagging behind. They were much more subjected to discrimination. You know, people now talk about microaggressions. We found that they experience a great number of microaggressions. But the thing that disturbed us the most in the finding was the tensions, the lack of connection between Black and white women in the workplace. And that we felt would hamper women. We felt that that would be a barrier to every woman realizing her goal or changing the corporate setting for women. If women did not unite in solidarity, if women didn't understand the differences among themselves and ended up in being in competition for the few positions that women would be allowed to take, that in the long term, this would not be good for gender equality in the broadest sense. So that was the finding that left us uncomfortable, that we did not find this camaraderie or the ability of the women to understand each other or to build relationships with one another. And unfortunately, that issue continues. I think it's very difficult for a group to attain equality if there is internal misunderstanding of how to work together. And so our point is, we tell people, we talk to companies, is that intersectionality is very important in understanding that people have multiple identities. And if you really want to build leaders who can advance your company, you need leaders who understand how differences intersect and how those differences could make a difference in how people advance in an organization. So that was the most surprising learning from that book. In addition to understanding that Black women had to take a different path to get to the top. I hope that makes sense to you.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. How do these issues play out in South Africa?
Same thing. It's the same thing. See, this is what's quirky, because one time in South Africa, I did this presentation, and boy, did I get hammered. But the data were there to prove it. That, you see, in South Africa, what happened because of apartheid and the nature of apartheid, where Black men were cheap labor. They were a source of cheap labor, if you remember. And women were relegated to the homelands. In fact, one of the ministers, one of the architects of apartheid once said, Black women are unnecessary appendages. All we need are the men to come and do the labor. So even though the ANC had a deep commitment to women's equality, what happened was Black men were the preferred candidates for transforming the economy. So, you know, the first Black CEOs, the first Black ministers, the high positions were going to Black men. And so Black women were still pretty much lagging behind. Patriarchy was real, even though there were official statements about gender equality. So if you look at the data in South Africa, other than in government employment, where women are doing well, in the private sector, Black women lag behind Black men. So Black men were your best candidate, right? So in the US, if you look at the intersection of race and gender, the hierarchy is there. Preferred candidate for senior leadership, white males, now followed by white women in the US, you know, and then people of color after that. So there's these racial hierarchies, racial and gender hierarchies that you can pretty much see in both countries. Although now there's a lot of emphasis being placed in South Africa on gender transformation.
There's a brilliant book by Leon Prieto and Simone Phipps, African American Management History. And it's really interesting because it tells the stories of African American management and organizational pioneers who should be role models, but actually history has generally been interpreted through a white lens. And there have been somebody like Charles Clinton Spalding in the 1930s who championed cooperative advantage, really innovative thinkers and practitioners, and he had a really successful business. So the role models have been eliminated from history, really.
Yes, and so the icons, you know, I used to teach that in my leadership class. I would start my lectures by showing students the covers, you know, the covers of these leadership books where you have the heroic white male leader, you know, the books by Lee Gerstner, who led IBM, and there's a picture of him sitting on the desk, and then there was Rudy Giuliani, the mayor of New York, and they always, Jack Welch, the legendary Jack Welch. And I used to show this to students and say, what's wrong with this picture? Because in fact, it was giving young MBA candidates the image that the ideal manager, the prototype of an ideal manager was a white male who single-handedly led his company to great profit sharing, great returns on investment. And so when you're sitting in a class in South Africa, it was the same issue, although now we have many more that we can point to. So you're right that we're not giving people, when you're teaching and you're only using materials on one set of leaders, you're basically marginalizing the students in your class. So that's another thing I've tried to do. I've tried to, you know, transform my own curriculum, my own teaching. This is a big issue in South Africa, decolonizing our knowledge to offer students a fuller understanding of the contributions of Africa to, you know, management and to knowledge. And you're right, all of that has been ignored, as if there's never been any great management or leadership anywhere else in the world. And it you know, I told students, you know, it's sort of like leadership comes from America, and our textbooks, you know, are only changing recently in terms of trying to offer a much more diverse profile of what good leadership looks like and should be.
And you're involved with the African Academy of Management.
Yes.
But why is that important, do you think? Why is an African Academy of Management important?
It's exactly what I said. Africa has been written out of management knowledge. colonization basically said we found a backwards Africa. The Europeans came in and brought civilization to Africa. And so Africa has nothing to offer to the world. And, you know, one of the things I did when I got to South Africa, I wanted to teach my MBA students. And so I picked up all the management textbooks and I would go to the index and look for Africa. You can't find anything, nothing. And Stuart, I said to my husband, I cannot stand here in front of these students who are mostly Black students and teach leadership when I don't have any materials that represent their reality or their history. So we founded the Africa Academy of Management to bring together a group of scholars and practitioners who were interested in writing about and researching management knowledge for and about Africa. And it's made such a difference. I don't want to brag, but what we're doing, we do capacity building, trying to support young African doctoral students and academics, but we even started our own journal, the Africa Journal of Management. And there we are able to present dynamic research about management in Africa. And that has made a difference. So we're trying to produce materials that are relevant, not going for history, but contemporary, and realizing that we have lots of knowledge that we need to generate that fits the African context. We can't take, you know, Jack Welch's story or some current CEO story in the US and just teach African students that the context is totally different. So that's why we started. We also started it to have a community. As I said to you, I'm a big believer in building a collective community to make change. And so working together, although we don't have a lot of money, what we have is a lot of passion and dedication. And I think that has allowed us to do well as an organization.
Looking back, who are the big mentors in your career?
Wow.
Because now you're working with young academics and helping them as a mentor. Who were the key figures for you?
Oh, I had many people, but I tell you, the number one mentor I had, she's still with us, my mother. My mother, Eva Brown, is 102 years old. And the message she gave us was, you can be anything you want to be. My mother had to cut her own education short. I always say my mother's the smartest person I know and my biggest critic. And she doesn't have a PhD, but my mother stopped her school education because she said, I saw my father walking barefoot and I told him a lie. I told him I didn't like school anymore, but I couldn't watch my father plowing the little field with his bare feet. So my mother, but in terms of academic career, it was a lot of people. It was mostly the people like, these are people who are no longer with us. At UMass Amherst, it was George Ordeon, who was the Mr. MBO, Management by Objectives. And he also kept saying, Stella, you can be anything you want to be. He gave me some of my first writing tips. Right now, Jim Walsh, who was president of the Academy of Management, supportive to us on the Africa Academy of Management. Those are just some people who impacted me. But the key to all of them was hearing from them that affirming what I wanted to do. And I think that makes a great mentor, but also telling me, don't go that way. But I think affirmation, which I was not always getting from other voices.
Your mother, 102, is pretty amazing. She had 10 children and a life obviously of a very, very hard life. It's quite an
I
amazing
know.
achievement.
That's right. And as I said, she's intuitively a very smart person. And to get a message from somebody, you can be anything you want to be, is a very powerful message, especially to shut out those negative voices who don't expect anything of you.
So when you look at the organizational world now,
yes,
what needs to happen? Because there's a lot of talk and a lot of things appear to be happening, but what would you like to see happen in the corporate world?
I would like to stop the talking, and I would like to see issues of social difference and diversity become strategic, truly strategic issues, not something that we do only when there is a crisis, like the murder of George Floyd, but it must become everyday practice, and it must be on the agenda of the senior leadership. And I think companies have to make a choice. All organizations have to make a choice. They have to choose social justice and social equality, just as they choose other important goals and put that at the top of the list. Anything that you really, I've worked in companies. If a company is struggling in a competitive environment or they're struggling with a client, then people organize and they make that a strategic priority. We need radical strategic priority to the question of advancing gender equality, racial equality, class equality. We can do better in our organizations. And it means looking soberly and asking, the way we do things around here is not going to get us to equality. We have to change it. And so this mystery of what to do, this is what I get from companies, and they're looking for quick fixes. Can you come in and do a one-day workshop? I don't do that anymore because that's dishonest. It has to be as key as putting in a new strategy. I've been here in New York City, so I've had a chance to talk to some African American women and other women of color. And what I find astounding, you will talk to somebody who's been in their companies for 15 years. They have an MBA from an Ivy League business school. I'm using the term now, I may write about it. They have literally often been parked. I call it parking, where they take the woman or the person of color and they literally park them somewhere in the company. They're not looked at. They're not on the list for CEO. They're not on the list for a senior position. But they only point to them when somebody says, how are you doing for diversity? Then they say, oh, wow, we have so-and-so who's been here 15 years. But the person is parked. And sort of like you having a car and you can point at it and say, I have a car here, but I never drive it. I never do anything with it, but I do have a car. So it's sort of like I do have this Black person, or I do have this woman. And so, companies need to get serious and stop the lip service and to really focus on making a change.
But who gets this? You must encounter organizations that actually do it the right way. There must be best practice out there.
Well, I hate to say it. I wish there's a few, yes. And the ones who do it, it's because of the leadership. And they do it. And they do it in spite of resistance from the shareholders. They do it in spite of managers who say, well, if I do that, I can't focus on the bottom line. They also are willing to let go of managers who lose women talent or Black talent. I don't want to name names, but yes. And I tell you, I'll use a great public example in the US now. We're talking about this. I must say, President Joe Biden, if you look at him in terms of who he has appointed to his senior positions in the US government, he has appointed more women and people of color than any president in recent times, even Obama, even though he was told not to, that it would hurt him politically. So the leaders that I have seen who do it, Stuart, they're brave enough to go against the grain, even from their shareholders and also from their other senior leaders. And that takes a lot of commitment to do that. Because it's easier to say, well, I couldn't find anybody who was qualified.
Are you optimistic? I mean, you've been campaigning and researching on these subjects for your entire career, and as you say, progress has often been, well, progress has stalled or is very slow at best. Are you optimistic there's a momentum? I mean, there seemed to be with the George Floyd in recent years that there did appear to be a new momentum, but has that dissipated?
You know what? I'm kind of in a liminal space. Some days I'm more optimistic than others. What I will say, I think the momentum behind George Floyd is still there for some companies, not all companies. I think what's going to happen, it's going to be more that you see more, as more people, I mean, like, for example, the Fortune 500 now has close to 50 women CEOs. I think there's a momentum that will eventually happen where it will be difficult for companies to ignore the talent that's out there. They're going to need the talent. I think it's going to happen like that, where they're going to need the talent, and that will sway the momentum. So I'm kind of not 100% sure, but I think it's one of these things where the tide will carry the change versus a lot of companies driving it, if you understand what I'm saying. You know, I do think that I've encountered, I won't name the company, but I've encountered a few of the women CEOs, and they clearly understand from their own experiences the issue of gender equality. And I just say to them, okay, if you understand what it was like for you, make sure you think about the other groups, racial equality, you know, sexual identity, class equality, because you can then leverage your own experience to be a voice for change, a person of change, you see. So I think it's going to happen that way. I don't think it can necessarily happen by legislation. I think it's going to be the changing numbers of people and critical mass.
Inspiration and role models. But
inspiration and role models. Like, for example, let's just say the work I'm doing in South Africa now. Every young Black or Indian or woman academic that I can help to find their scholarly voice, help them to get to a senior appointment, help them to publish, they eventually will become a critical mass. You see? So I'm really clear that we got to make sure that this group does well, so that you have many people out there writing about management in Africa, teaching students. Students get professors who look like them. You see?
I think the solidarity element you brought out in Our Separate Ways is interesting. So I'm British, and we've had 3 women, well, we've had 2 women prime ministers, and are just about to have another woman prime minister. But I don't think that's had any impact whatsoever, because there was no solidarity. They didn't work to build that solidarity with other women.
See, that's my point. If that frankly, I tell them, if you get a seat at the table, what are you going to do? If you only got the seat at the table for individual advancement, then it's not going to make a difference. So if you get that seat at the table, use it. And I think you're right. That's a great example, using your own country. So that's why I said, I think Joe Biden is using his seat to say, I'm going to appoint the first Black Secretary of Defense. I'm going to appoint a Native American person. I can do it. I'm going to do it. So hopefully, if we get a seat at the table and we don't do that, when I got, like I said now, I was fortunate to get tenure. I got it based on my work on race and social difference. And that has allowed other people, the thing that humbles me is I'll often get young academics, and even now some who are doing very well, who will say, Stella, I don't know if you know this, but when I read that article, The Emperor Has No Clothes, I felt like, wow, I can study race. So to the extent that my work became a role model for them, that you can do that research and get tenure, that's great. Because then there's more of us doing it. And then, in fact, that's what one of the editors, Stuart, maybe I'm going too long, but I believe that because I remember an article I sent to a top journal. The editor wrote, thank you for that, but no thank you. And he basically said, race is not an important topic. And even if I did a special issue on this topic, it wouldn't be race because there's no members in the Academy of Management interested in it, which I thought was, okay, so what do I do? So now that we have more people doing research on race, gender, and diversity, the topic doesn't have the taboo it had when I was trying to do it in the early 80s. And maybe I'm naive, but that's what I'm saying. So the more people we can get a critical mass, unfortunately, we have to prove ourselves. The more women, the more Black women, the more people of color who get into these senior roles, they identify with the issue, they bring in other people, they mentor them, then it becomes, hopefully, normalized that our organization must look this way. So I think it's going to be more organic and working from the bottom up versus leaders from the top who are, I don't know. I just think if you get a few people who understand it and they start and they do change, we get more people out there. I believe in critical mass, like Margaret Mead. Never underestimate what a few determined people can do.
And you said you're semi-retired now.
It's a joke.
So,
everybody says.
Have you got another book in the pipeline? I know you said a new edition of Our Separate Ways has come out, but have you got something?
You know what? I'm ambivalent. I've thought about it, but then I'm like, no, I think I want to do what I'm doing, the mentoring, because, a book, you have to go in and be by yourself and lock yourself in a room. So I'm not sure. I get offers and I have some ideas maybe, but right now I'm just enjoying helping with the next generation of academics and being of support to them.
Stella, thank you very much. I would strongly recommend anybody to seek out Our Separate Ways for the true story of life in organizations for many people. Really important work. And thank you, Stella, for making a difference.
Thank you, Stuart, for the conversation, and thank you for the honor to be considered as a person who's made a contribution. It's a real honor. Thank you.